Unresolved historical disputes. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, 5 Lithuanian Orthodox priests refused to mention the name of Patriarch Kirill of Moscow during the liturgy, the very man who blessed the war. They were punished immediately, first suspended, then denounced as schismatics, and finally expelled. The priests appealed to the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople, and last year, the Exarchate of the Ecumenical Patriarchate in Lithuania was officially established. Those Orthodox Christians who are now under Constantinople have their own community, but no house of prayer. Every Orthodox church in Lithuania still belongs to Moscow. Shouldn't Lithuania take action and reclaim Orthodox real estate owned by Moscow? Today, Professor Alfredis Bumblauskas meets to discuss this with philosopher, writer, and former politician Mantas Adaminas. We are standing in the Church of St. Nicholas, the Wonder Worker, here in Lukiškės. Today, however, we will not be speaking about the saint himself, nor about miracles, but about those who now dwell here. True Orthodox Lithuanian Christians who today are in canonical subordination to the Patriarchate of Constantinople. Isn't it time for Lithuania to reclaim its Orthodox heritage? Property that still belongs to Moscow. That is our topic today. Let's start with that first. Now, Igor Skoshelas and Andrzej Gil, a Ukrainian and a Polish, developed the concept of the Kościół Wschodni, the Eastern Church. Their central idea is this. When we speak of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, there was a third participant, the Eastern Christian Church of the Commonwealth of the two nations. To me, that idea feels deeply convincing. I even managed to persuade our Ukrainian colleagues, including Igor Skoshelas himself, to create a book about the Basilian order in Vilnius. And after reading the work of Gil and Skoshelas, I realized something important, that for us Lithuanians, it is still difficult to truly grasp the legacy of Eastern Christianity.
I don't have that many books here. I can't lay them all out before you. But where I could connect with this subject, even in a small way, was through my personal fascination with Byzantine culture. From the perspective of Western Europe, Byzantium often seems distant, alien, even strange. Indeed, when we were taught in schools and universities, Byzantine culture was presented as something exotic, long dead and gone. Yet in reality, our Grand Dukes engaged in active diplomacy. It was one of the key directions in which they steered their southeastern policy. And the fact that Moscow later rose by claiming to be the heir of Byzantium's so-called imaginary legitimacy, the idea of the Third Rome, from which we still suffer, is directly connected to the Second Rome, Constantinople, Byzantium itself. It is also tied to the very battles we fought in the 15th and 16th centuries. We must remember, Lithuania was truly a global player, drawing strength from two great powers. On one side, it sought to contain the might of Moscow. On the other, the power of the Ottoman Empire. That was a later period, but Byzantium was their common predecessor. And it was the fall of Constantinople that opened the path both for Moscow's rise and for Turkey's further advance into Europe.
You are a philosopher who sees the East.
Among other things, I had to put that perspective into practice when I served as Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, because the East was my portfolio.
Main portfolio.
This diplomat, as they say.
That's good, and now tell me, did Lithuania make any mistakes?
Now we're speaking specifically about our main topic, the Orthodox Church in Lithuania. Unlike the Estonians, during the interwar period, Lithuania didn't pay attention to the fact that the Orthodox Church under the Moscow Patriarchate was operating on its territory. They didn't see it as a threat. They didn't want to damage relations with Moscow. Meanwhile, the Estonians made sure that an Orthodox Church was established in Estonia under the authority of Constantinople, one that did not answer to Moscow. And that is the key difference. The Orthodox world, in essence, is divided between those churches that recognize the primacy of Constantinople and the Moscow Patriarchate, which, after Constantinople, is the most powerful among all the others. Constantinople may have fewer followers, but it holds a kind of moral authority. The Patriarch of Constantinople is first among equals, somewhat like the Pope in the West, possessing a special status and the right to resolve disputes.
Estonia found the strength to align itself with Constantinople during the interwar period.
When church property was being returned, the Estonians made an effort to ensure that a significant portion of it went under the authority of the Constantinople Church. Meanwhile, in Lithuania, there operated not only an economically unprofitable diocese, but effectively a branch of the Moscow Patriarchate, the same kind you would find in Smolensk or even Irkutsk. From the perspective of the Moscow Patriarchate, Lithuania is seen as just another Russian territory, a church territory of Russia, and the bishops of Vilnius and Trakai are directly subordinate to the Patriarch of Moscow. It somehow sounds awkward, and the historical background itself is even more awkward. Why is that? Because, historically, the Orthodox in Lithuania were always under the authority of Kiev. It was here, in fact, that the Metropolitan of Kiev often resided. After all, this was the political capital when Kiev belonged to the Grand Duchy of Lithuania.
But at a certain point, the Metropolitan of Kiev, living in Vilnius, became Greek Catholic, that is, a uniate, following the church union.
This added yet another layer of complexity, because from that Eastern Church, a segment broke away, the Orthodox who did not join the union.
In other words, the main actors are Moscow and Constantinople. Moscow, it turns out, separated into its own patriarchate without even asking Constantinople.
And indeed, if we wanted to preserve some historical accuracy, the uniates would have to be set aside, because Constantinople regards the uniates just as negatively as the rest of the Orthodox world does. They are people who broke away and went to another authority, the Roman See, the Pope in the Vatican.
Yes, but I think all of Lithuania confuses all of this. The Greek Catholics, it's the same thing.
The Greek Catholics are Catholics of the Eastern Rite. They are part of the Roman Catholic Church, but they have preserved the Eastern liturgical tradition.
We just saw that Rome is not anywhere else, but in the Vatican. So you're saying, let's set the Greek Catholics aside. Now, Constantinople represents the side rejected by Moscow.
This rejection began with the rise of the Third Rome idea in Moscow. Following the fall of Constantinople as a political center in 1453, Moscow sought to leverage the legacy of Byzantium for its own consolidation. Indeed, the remarkably capable Tsar Ivan III, capable, though not honorably, but as a cunning and ruthless strategist, took full advantage of it.
But we must remember, he was the son-in-law of Alexander Jagiellon, the father of Helena, right? We had placed so many hopes on not having to go to war with Moscow, yet he seized a quarter of our territory.
And he is also a descendant of Vytautas's daughter.
Exactly.
All of the Western world at that time was burning with hope, how to reclaim Constantinople, how to drive the Turks out of Constantinople once again. And at the court of Sforza, not by chance, Sforza, together with Cardinal Vissarion, who had arrived from Constantinople, was one of the supporters of the church union, alongside humanists. At Sforza's court, the idea arose, what if we marry the niece of the last Byzantine emperor, Sophia Palaiologina, to a Russian prince? Perhaps we could draw the Russian prince into a forming grand coalition against the Turkish Sultan. But this coalition included not only the King of France, not only the Papal territories, not only Sforza's court, the Genoese and Venetians, but also Turkmen tribes beyond Turkish influence, the Moldavians, meaning the princes of Moldavia and Wallachia, King Stephen, the Crimean Byzantine kingdom where the Palaiologos dynasty still survived. All forces, and of course Lithuania and Poland, had to join this great coalition. And in 1572, when the Princess Empress Sophia Palaiologos marries Ivan III, what happens? He does not join the coalition. This is a typical example of naive Western, Italian. They thought they could manipulate Russia. In reality, Russia manipulates them. Through Sophia, they inherit the Byzantine legacy, Byzantine court etiquette, the double-headed eagle, and the imperial title Caesar, Emperor, or Tsar. For the word Tsar is derived from Caesar in Russian. They begin to call themselves emperors. They adopt the double-headed eagle, the emblem of the Byzantine emperors. And around Ivan III emerges the idea of the Third Rome. There was the First Roman Empire, which fell. The Second Rome, Constantinople, destroyed by the Turks. And now Moscow would be the Third Rome. There would be no fourth. This was the millennium-long empire, the empire of the end of the world, destined ultimately to dominate everything. This sense of exceptionalism, which traces very directly to Putin's trajectory today, has its roots in what was happening in the 15th century, 500 years ago.
I'll share a bit of my emotional perspective. It seems the friendliest Russian, or as I now say, Rossian, especially after a few drinks, always says, "How could you manage without us? We are still something superior." The idea of the Third Rome persists even among Democrats.
It seems to me they have a sense of exceptionalism, a special Russian mission, that Russia will somehow save the world. From Dostoevsky to today's Dugin, the message is the same. Russia will offer an alternative to a decaying West, while also bringing a source of civilized renewal to be transmitted back to the West. This mindset dates back to the time when they began to see themselves in opposition to the First and Second Romes. From then on, expansion began. And with it, the idea emerged that if the Emperor of Byzantium moves to Moscow, the center of Eastern Christianity should move as well. It was at this point that the patriarchal status was created. Before this, Moscow was governed by a metropolitan, an archbishop equal to Kiev, and even subordinate to the metropolitan of Kiev. The Lithuanian Orthodox Church had always been under Kiev's authority. In the 17th century, the new Moscow Patriarch bribed the extremely weakened Patriarchate of Constantinople with sables, caviar, and gold. And in 1686, at the end of the 17th century, signed an agreement
by which the Lithuanian metropolis was removed from Constantinople's jurisdiction.
Yes, Kiev and all that belonged to Kiev were transferred under Moscow's authority, and automatically, so were the Lithuanian Orthodox. The patriarchs of Constantinople tried to contest this move. They issued documents denying its legality, but de facto, everything had already been seized, from church buildings to, so to speak, the minds and hearts of the faithful.
So, what should be done now? Well, you are such a philosopher who is now tasked with tackling real political and diplomatic issues.
A real diplomatic problem arose in 2022, on February 24th, when Russia launched a full-scale aggression against Ukraine. 5 Lithuanian Orthodox priests refused to submit to Patriarch Kirill, who, as is well known, had from the very beginning supported and blessed the Russian invasion. They refused to pray for him.
The Orthodox Church's response to political events was already noticeable in 2014, right after the annexation of Crimea, says Father Vitaly Motskus. Back then, he confesses, he naively believed it would soon pass, and as a priest, he concentrated on spiritual matters.
It became increasingly clear that political developments were affecting the life of the Church, shaping the opinions of the faithful and their upbringing. After all, priests must speak, answer questions, and the topic of the Russian world was becoming ever more relevant.
The priest recalls that when Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, staying silent was no longer an option.
We had to respond in some way because the Moscow Patriarch had begun speaking about the war, and not in a Christian manner. We had to respond both to his words and to his calls for a holy war. It was necessary to speak out. And we were told, maybe don't get involved. But there were 5 of us priests, and we answered, we are not interfering in politics. We are assessing what is happening from a moral perspective. When there is sin, we call it sin. When actions are sinful, we name them as such. It doesn't matter who commits them, our own, strangers, acquaintances, or foreigners. Moreover, I believe that a person must always have the courage to speak, even about oneself during confession or elsewhere, acknowledging one's mistakes. Yes, I acted wrongly, I erred, I sinned, I committed a crime, it happens, but I repent. And here too, we had to speak about our church, that we should not support such a stance by church leadership.
The priests who spoke out were declared a threat and were accused of sowing division within the church.
And they simply crushed us. When they saw that we were supported by other Christian communities, state institutions, and, most importantly, society, I don't even know who didn't support us. They had to invent accusations against us so that the broad public, even Orthodox believers, would not really realize and understand what was happening here.
People have little understanding of canon law. This loophole was exploited, the priest explains. Priests who disagreed with Russian demagoguery were accused of causing a schism, of splitting the church.
Even when I served at the cathedral, notices began appearing on church doors and bulletin boards, claiming that we had been preparing a schism for many years and now had struck a blow in the back. They said it was especially painful for the bishop, which is why he convened an ecclesiastical court that condemned us.
The priests were not allowed to explain themselves, nor to know in advance what they were being accused of. After the so-called trial, all 5 of them were expelled.
So what do we do now? This is clearly unjust. We decided to appeal to the Church of Constantinople, which has the authority to hear appeals from other independent churches. We asked that, if our appeal were accepted, we be received under its jurisdiction, since there was no longer a place for us in the Moscow Patriarchate. And finally, after 7 months of consideration, on February 16, 2023, We learned that our appeal had been granted and that we had been accepted into the clergy of the Constantinople Patriarchate, into the ranks of its clergy.
Father Vitaly Moskus recalls the period when he was unable to perform his duties.
It was very difficult. My well-being suffered terribly because, as a priest, I could not celebrate the liturgy or perform services for such a long time. And that was the hardest, the most terrible part. Of course, there was also the practical, material side. A priest in Lithuania usually lives off the church, that is, from the donations of the faithful. And when we lost all our duties, we naturally had no income. So I had to find a job. What kind of job? Well, I have no other profession, because right after school, I entered the seminary. So I ended up working as a driver. I transported people, worked with Bolt taxi, and earned my living that way. But I say, the hardest part was the spiritual side. Not being able to celebrate Mass. For a priest, those were the darkest days of my life. True, I have experienced many hardships in life, but this was the darkest of all.
At that time, I was the deputy minister, and the Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs asked me to take up this matter, to try to establish diplomatic contact with the Patriarchate of Constantinople. Of course, the initiative of the priests alone might not have succeeded, since few people appealed directly to the Patriarch of Constantinople. He is, in a sense, the arbiter for the entire Orthodox world. What happened next? I established contact with the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Patriarchate of Constantinople, Archbishop Emmanuel Adamakis, almost my namesake. By September of that year, I made an official visit to the Patriarch of Constantinople to present this matter to him.
So he is the same as the Pope for Eastern Christianity.
Yes, he has his own Vatican in Istanbul, on the shore of the Golden Horn. It's a small fenced area, but with its own cathedral and palace. It is not a state within a state. It does not have the status of a state. It doesn't have that recognition, but he is the head of all Orthodox Christians.
And the Islamic State of Turkey supports him, or rather tolerates him.
Yes, the Islamic State of Turkey. It protects, supports, recognizes, and tolerates him. Moreover, there are specific arrangements. For example, a portrait of Ataturk hangs in his office, but the Patriarch of Constantinople cannot be someone who has not served in the Turkish army. In other words, he must be an Orthodox Greek, born and raised in Turkey.
Is that some kind of security document, right?
Yes, this is an interesting detail. The Turks try in this way to maintain control. He must be a citizen of Turkey, and not just have a residence permit, but actually have grown up in the country.
So you took the Lithuanian issue there.
Yes, I took the Lithuanian issue there. I had an audience with His Holiness, Patriarch Bartholomew. The Patriarch was deeply moved that these 5 priests had effectively risked all their livelihood and financial security. And these are people with families. Unlike Catholic priests, they have wives and children. By church standards, everything happened very quickly. If it took Ukrainians 5 years to achieve this, in Lithuania, by the following February, the priests were already reinstated, their right to serve restored. And in early March, Patriarch Bartholomew visited Lithuania. He was received as a very important figure, almost like a head of state, and announced the restoration of the Constantinople Patriarchate's jurisdiction in Lithuania. An exarchate was established, a church territory directly subordinate to Constantinople.
You said restoration, but did it exist before?
Yes, it existed until it was transferred to Moscow.
We are talking about the year 1686.
Yes.
So we are kind of rewriting this fragment, reinterpreting it, and telling it anew.
Yes, and in the documents presented and signed by the Patriarch, it is stated that the illegal act of transferring the Lithuanian metropolis to Moscow is annulled.
And this illegal act is described as corruption, the very bribes of sables, caviar, and everything else, correct?
Yes. The Moscow Patriarch bought, through bribes, the right to oversee the Orthodox faithful of Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine, all the lands of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. This is exactly what makes Moscow extremely angry. And if I may mention, just over a year ago, an official list of Russia's main enemies in Lithuania was published. According to the Russian Foreign Ministry, 5 people considered the biggest enemies of Russia in Lithuania. I am one of them, and I believe it is precisely because of this. Moscow reacts very painfully to the fact that Lithuania has been restored under the jurisdiction of Constantinople.
And what kind of person did Bartholomew seem to be? Are our Orthodox faithful in good hands?
Very good.
Actually, we bear no prejudice, neither toward Eastern Christians, nor Uniates, nor Catholics.
Indeed, Patriarch Bartholomew got along perfectly with all the popes. He knew John Paul, Benedict, Francis, and had already met with Leon. He is a person who truly strives for church unity from the heart. So there is no doctrinal conflict here. And he is extraordinarily warm. When he spoke in the Lithuanian Seimas, recalling what had been said from the Vatican at the time, I remember government representatives saying, "If only our Pope spoke as clearly, principled, and inspiringly."
And Bartholomew even, one might say, rose higher in authority. All right, let's not dwell on that, so that no one gets offended. Once we came under Constantinople's protection, we had to begin everything anew, says Father Vitaly Motzkus. We had to rebuild everything, starting with the community itself.
Some people, upon learning what had happened, left with us. Without being able to act as priests, we would gather by arrangement with the leadership at the House of National Communities, sing psalms, read the scriptures, converse, and spiritually support each other during those difficult days. Gradually, a small community began to form. We couldn't really publicize it. Where and whom could we invite? We couldn't celebrate the Eucharist, couldn't distribute communion. For people, of course, this was no real alternative. We were simply waiting for the appeal and did not know if it would be accepted. When we were received by Constantinople, both the mayor of Vilnius, first Shimasius, and later the current mayor, supported us and helped in every way they could. For example, this room was provided to us by the municipality. They also helped us arrange to use the former prison church in Lukiškės, at least on Sundays, for a few hours, so that we could celebrate the Eucharist there. And gradually, having a few such places, which we did not own but were allowed to use for services, we began inviting people to join us. We understand, of course, that this does not replace large, beautiful, or traditionally organized Orthodox churches, but still, modest as it is, sometimes without anyone to sing, we can pray with a clear conscience, without promoting the Russian world, and without speaking positively of Patriarch Kirill. So that people do not think he is a good man. And this is how we gradually built our community today. We already have 10 communities in Lithuania, and thank God they are growing. There are 4 in Vilnius: Lithuanian, Russian, Belarusian, and Ukrainian, as well as in Kaunas, Klaipėda, Tauragė, Šiauliai, Panevėžys, Alytus, and Anykščiai. We still meet people who, surprised, say, "It's already been 2 years since you were established, and we hadn't heard anything about you. Now we'll come to pray, knowing nothing, because really we have no such opportunities to invite people as, say, in a Catholic church, where services take place regularly. We cannot organize meetings or events at our discretion whenever we want. People walking through the city, seeing a church, can enter, pray, and speak with the priest. We don't have such places where people can simply come in and pray. As our Exarch says, these are not problems, but challenges that may slightly slow our formation and especially growth. But thank God, we remember the first days. For example, when we began praying. In Kaunas, starting from Easter 2023, I began to pray. A few people came to both the Ukrainian and Lithuanian liturgies. Now we already have several dozen. And of course, as in most religious communities, there are those who come every Sunday, a small minority. Those who come for major feasts are already more numerous.
O kurie per didesnės šventes ateina, tai jų jau yra daugiau.
Unresolved historical disputes. All right, dear Mantas, but someone still needs to be scolded. For what should we be scolded? Why were we so careless until now? Why didn't our state complete those homework assignments? Why did we realize so late? I clearly remember 1990, the St. Judas Council. I don't know in what capacity, but Chrysostomus was there. The Orthodox Church seemed to recognize the process on March 11th, Lithuania's independence. The idea. Something was initiated then, but afterwards it faded away.
It seems to me that Chrysostomus was rather an exception. He was appointed to Lithuania at the beginning of Perestroika, when it was realized that Lithuania might take a different path. He was, in a sense, a dissident. As far as I know, the Russian Church itself decided to get rid of him, and he truly was a man who for a long time shaped the image of the Orthodox Church in Lithuania, as close to us and by no means hostile. After the events of January 13th, he addressed the crowd from a balcony, speaking to Russian-speaking citizens of Lithuania, urging them to support Lithuania's independence. We cannot deny this. And perhaps this created the impression that Moscow later began to exploit, gaining trust gradually. Moscow did not immediately saturate the Orthodox Church with Putinism. It did not immediately turn it into an instrument of the Kremlin for spreading ideas and propaganda. This process happened gradually, and Putin's arrival came much later. At that time, when Lithuania was establishing new state structures, the Moscow Patriarchate was perceived as not at all hostile.
Maybe they wanted to pacify us by insisting that all was well.
I think that every time we trusted Moscow, we were just reassuring ourselves. Indeed, creating an alternative, or at least taking care to establish an autonomous, autocephalous, or other kind of church here, should have been done much earlier. In the 1990s, it would have been much easier, especially before restitution, which is also an important point. Lithuania, as a rule of law state, returned property to all churches whose assets had been seized by the Soviet authorities. The property of the Catholic Church was returned to the Catholic Church. And since, in interwar Lithuania, only the Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate was active, it was precisely this church that received back the nationalized property, which, it should be noted, had been nationalized much less than that of the Catholics. There were proportionally far more Orthodox churches than Catholic ones. When property was returned, it was restored to the same hands. Lithuania cannot be reproached for that. It adhered to the principles of a rule of law state. But the fact that, during the interwar period, we did not create an autonomous church or one subordinated to Constantinople rather than Moscow is truly a mark against the interwar Republic of Lithuania.
All right, but what should we do now? What are we to do? And for me, for example, it's disappointing. I've just approved the Jonas Kristupas Glaubitz observation deck. Yet on the street remains a plaque reading, Randy's. I've always joked that Vilnius is run by people from Kaunas in the countryside who don't really understand the city. Randy Street is dedicated to Glaubitz. Thank God, at least there's now an observation deck with a church. We have Glaubitz's name, the Iconostasis by Glaubitz in the Church of the Holy Spirit, belonging to the Orthodox Church. It's one of the Master's brilliant works, but it turns out we cannot fully claim it as ours because the property belongs to Moscow.
Nowadays, there are indeed voices saying, let's take everything back, because it once belonged to the Metropolitan of Kiev, and therefore to the Patriarchate of Constantinople.
But you just cited 1686. Were the Orthodox already under Moscow then? As I understand it, they still had the so-called right to independently raise the cross, a nuanced canonical concept, and were not truly under Moscow.
Because they never politically belonged to that space. They were not part of the political territory of the Russian Empire. In the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, other church provinces were active. In the Crown, Poland, there was also an autocephalous Polish Orthodox Church. So yes, again, there are examples that were never part of Constantinople. For instance, the Orthodox Cathedral in Užupis, near Vilnele, was built specifically as a church of the Patriarchate of Constantinople, and much of its walls have been preserved. But if we look at all the 19th century churches, in Zverinas, near the Kalvariju market, and at the upper part of Basanavičiaus Street, all of them were already built as Moscow churches. So, on one hand, we understand that they were transferred unlawfully, but on the other, we must also recognize that those colonial churches appeared later.
All right, but I still missed it. Let's clarify. The cathedral in Vilnele, the so-called Church of St. Paraskeva,
or the Church of St. Nicholas on Digija Street. After all, they all date back to the time of the Constantinople Patriarchate.
So we should say that nevertheless, these are 5 priests, the new Constantinople ones. They have the right to moral law, undoubtedly.
Now, as for the legal right, of course, the matter is very complicated because Again, it depends on how deeply the legal mechanisms operate, and Lithuania, as a rule-of-law state, has already expressed its position through restitution, recognizing them as the lawful owners. And if we were to challenge this now, we would, in effect, be undermining the very foundations beneath ourselves.
But can't we challenge it the way Constantinople disputed the legality of the decision from the late 17th century?
Of course we can. And that's exactly what I was striving to achieve and trying to put into practice.
So why didn't it work?
I aim to implement the creation of a Constantinople Church province here in Lithuania, and it actually happened. Now, regarding property, it is, first and foremost, subject to the laws of the Republic of Lithuania. Decisions of the Constantinople Church do not have direct legal consequences within the Lithuanian legal system, only to the extent that the Church is adopted into Lithuanian legislation. In other words, this issue actually goes beyond our historical discussion and enters a legal dimension, into the realm of legitimate expectations, accepted obligations, and, well, a certain respect for established decisions. And there is no simple answer here, so to speak, it seems to me. At this point, to be honest, I don't even believe in such top-down, willful decisions, because it seems to me that in church life, property may not be the most important thing. I believe that morally, Lithuanian Orthodox, those who are under Constantinople and see Lithuania as a Western state, and who recognize the crimes and lies of Kirill,
And who are on Ukraine's side?
yes, and who are on Ukraine's side, those who do not submit to this imperial ideology and propaganda, they should make it very clear by voting with their feet, by going to the Constantinople Church. And nothing prevents them from seeing the Austro churches, the cathedral, as churches that morally belong to them. But how could they reclaim them? Well, it seems to me that if all Lithuanian Orthodox joined the Constantinople Church, then these churches themselves would naturally follow them.
So, we saw the same thing during the expedition. I remember when we traveled across Ukraine, we were carefully recording, and our protagonist, Boris Tsirkus, who has already been on the front for 3 years, said, and they don't perform the funerals. Meaning those priests do not pray or sing requiem chants for those who died on the Donetsk front. All the divisions were already there. So let us hope that our Orthodox believers gently pay attention to what is happening in the world and in Ukraine, wishing that they would be on Ukraine's side and, accordingly, on the side of Constantinople.
And at the same time, on the side of Lithuania. Because being on Lithuania's side very clearly means being on the side of Constantinople, because it is here that the legitimate church tradition exists. Here is the history of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. And all the propagandists who come and point to the church domes and say, oh, this is part of Russian culture, they are lying. Because this was part of the Kiev metropolis. We belonged to that ancient Russian Orthodox community that looked more to the west, whose archbishop lived here and aligned himself with Constantinople, not with Moscow.
And I will dare to add, the so-called Kiev Cossack Baroque churches, which are not Uniate but Orthodox, were initiated by John the Baptist from Vilnius. That's how it all connects. It's not just the Byzantine domes, but also the smaller domes where the trace of that very John from Vilnius can be seen. Perhaps I may dare to say that we should continue to develop this topic. According to the Constitution, recognized traditional churches must have all the necessary conditions for their activities, including the restitution of property rights, says law professor and member of the European Parliament, Danius Gelimus. So currently, there is clearly an injustice in several aspects. First and foremost, regarding property. There are 2 traditional Orthodox churches, but the property belongs only to the Orthodox churches subordinated to Moscow.
Of course, it is unfair that the property belongs to only one of them. Such issues should be resolved, but it is not easy because today, de facto, all the property is controlled by one of them, and property is inviolable and can only be seized or transferred to someone else with appropriate compensation in cases provided by law, and so on.
These issues can be resolved in several ways, says Danius Šelemas.
One option is to adopt some special law and try to resolve this, preferably in agreement with both religious communities, or through the courts. But that would be very difficult, probably even more complicated than resolving such issues legislatively. Another aspect of the injustice, in my opinion, is that until recently in Lithuania, the Exarchate of the Constantinople Patriarchate had not been restored, and de facto the Moscow Patriarchate was the only one recognized as a traditional Lithuanian church without any dispute. But knowing the whole history, one can really doubt which of them is more traditional. After all, one is traditional in the sense that it operated in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, whereas the other today clearly serves the interests of another state. Despite some attempts to partially distance itself, formally and legally, it is still subordinated to the Moscow Patriarchate. And, as we know, there are major problems with the Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. Essentially, it is a state church, a state organization serving the interests of that state, and, moreover, interests opposed to Lithuania's independence. The mere fact that a branch of the Moscow Patriarchate exists here can be seen as evidence that the Lithuanian state is not fully legitimate in their eyes. From all the documents of the Russian Orthodox Church, it is clear that this is the purest embodiment of Russian state ideology, Rashism, or the ideology of the Russian world. They have approved documents on the concept of the Russian world. So here the issue of national security arises. Viewed through this lens, the injustice is double, not only in terms of property, but also from the perspective of national security. I don't know how justified it is to consider a church traditional when it essentially serves the interests of another state. There are probably various solutions that could be found. We know what the Latvians did. They stopped recognizing the Moscow Patriarchate and recognized the Church of the Constantinople Patriarchate. But for that, as they say, an elementary, first and foremost political will is needed. According to all church documents, one can easily find the concept of the Russian world that the Orthodox Church in Moscow is obliged to promote. We have its branch here. So, I think that is quite enough to question the recognition of this church as traditional. But I don't see any politicians in Lithuania brave enough to do that.
But still, sometimes such concerns arise that priests subordinated to the Moscow Orthodox Church, including those from the Russian-occupied Ukrainian territories of Donetsk and Luhansk, come to Vilnius. And of course, they will be on Moscow's side. In any case, they will probably continue Moscow's, Putin's, or Kirill's propaganda. So then, what should be done?
For that, we have laws. Just as we do not allow jihad to be preached in Lithuania, in the same way we cannot allow Moscow's military propaganda to be preached. This must be stopped as concrete actions. This is a separate issue, not directly related to what we have been discussing so far, but it is clear that it needs to be halted. However, most importantly, it seems to me that Lithuanian Orthodox believers themselves need to understand, how should I put it, that if they want to preserve their conscience, honor, and dignity, They cannot attend the church from which murderous genocidal propaganda comes, and whose head is Kirill, who is in fact a war criminal. I included Kirill in the sanctions list twice, and both times the Hungarians removed him.
Hungarians removed him.
Yes.
The Catholics.
Orban.
Orban removed him. Then it naturally follows that all these St. George ribbons, which we already know are bad, are serious, because they are now equated with Nazi crimes and Nazi symbols. Believers should also understand that this is not a joke, that it is becoming part of this Russian fascist ideology, and could quickly become fully so.
And the use of religion specifically for such political purposes, as a cover for spreading hatred and genocidal ideology, is a crime, and it must be clearly called out. But this is a separate issue, not like the complex historical intricacies we discussed earlier.